What do you think is the most important question that humans can ask?
Are we alone? That to me is the most important question. If we're not alone, then somebody else might have answers to other, let's say, less or more immediate existential questions, right? That, what can we do about this? What can we do about that? Or, are there other dimensions? You could list 1,000 questions, and if they would be willing to give us the answers. I mean, I've said this before. I think we're just a bunch of angry apes. I don't think we're ready for some of the answers yet. And it's like you don't tell your children certain things until they're mature enough. And we have pretty much proven that we're still not mature enough yet.
Hello, welcome to the Pretty Intense podcast. Today we have Garry Nolan on the show. Garry is a professor at Stanford of Pathology. He studies biology and microbiology. So he has a real background in medicine and in anything that you think of from a doctor standpoint, but he has really gone out on a limb and incorporated extraterrestrial craft, and he's been doing research on the materials themselves and really just like feeding that inner monologue of what are we here for? What are we? And trying to get those answers. So we did talk about that, of course, and we also talked about the human body and what it is and what is DNA and how does the body work and what is its interaction with this world? How did it come about? Where is it going? And at what levels does it exist? And so we talked also about the theories of the universe, of holographic universe, simulation theory, the multiverse. So this is the kind of conversation like that I just want to have all day, every day, where we are not sure about anything. And he makes that very clear, that these are all ifs, these are all just ideas and concepts and asking questions. But he also had a great thought that maybe the question is anchoring the answer in the universe. And so he explains what he means by that. So enjoy today's deeply fascinating episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. Let's get out there. Let's think outside the box. I can't wait to read them. You've got a doctor biology brain, but then you also have this other new interesting side of more science and data and aliens and UFOs, which is of course fascinating. So how did that end up happening? It feels like there's a lot of similarities, but it is such a transition to go from biology, microbiology, and being in the lab like that to, testing UFO materials.
Well, I mean, if you are a biologist, and I have both an undergrad in genetics at Cornell, and then I got my PhD at Stanford in the Department of Genetics. So, you're naturally driven to think about evolution and where did we come from, right? And so when you start thinking about the beginnings of life on this planet, if you do any amount of reading, you come across the theory of panspermia, right? And so panspermia basically meaning the distribution of life across the universe by an initial seeding that happened somewhere, and then it spread, as life does, like mold. It spreads. And so there's lots of ideas about this. People don't have a sense of what life can do. And if you look at, for instance, where did all of the material on this planet come from? The rocks, the metals, etc. They came from an exploding star that became a gas, which then eventually coalesced into a sun and planets. So that much time can go by between one star's existence and its birth of another star eventually. But during that event, you could imagine the explosion sending rocks and pieces of that original solar system elsewhere. And if there were spores or things on that, they could go along for the ride. And so that's the concept of panspermia, that At the very least, you could imagine microbial life spreading and then seeding life elsewhere. Now, then there's a different kind of panspermia notion that, if a intelligent race was ever, happened, several billions of years ago, it has more than enough time to spread across nearly the entire universe, even just at the speed of light, right? And so, it's not many steps to thinking about that. And especially for someone like me, I was interested in science fiction as a kid. And so all of these concepts were already there, for me at least. I mean, as fiction. But then, when you, as a scientist, come across instances of a question you might ask, rather than, let's say, being a member of the lay public where it remains a question, you can be sure of what you think the answer is. But, as a scientist, I have the means in my laboratory to actually study it, to answer the question. And that's always how I've been. I've always been about, okay, well, I'm interested in this part of biology. How do I do it? Okay, this is what I would need to do to prove or disprove this. And so I just bring the same ethic, the same approach to the alien problem or the non-human intelligence problem, in that, there's a lot of, let's say, we would call in the sciences preliminary data, right? There's a lot of preliminary data that suggests many different hypotheses. So some of those hypotheses are testable. So let's do it. So that's how I came to it.
Okay, so amazing. And I have a lot of those same questions. So you talked about, microbial life kind of spreading, right? It could be like a mold, but it just little spores and little bits could be spread out. What is that? When you say that microbial, what is it actually?
So it would be the spores of bacteria, for instance, right? So there's plenty of spores on Earth of bacteria that can survive space and hard radiation. Right? Bacillus, there's a number of bacillus strains that have this ability. So, if it's frozen and in vacuum, and it could last an awful long time. And we already have instances of bacteria and other living things, surviving hundreds of thousands of years and then being resurrected. Right. So it's not a big difference between 100,000 years and, say, 10 million or even a billion years, the time that it might take to go from one place to another. Imagine a large chunk of rock, like what Avi Loeb pointed out, the Uma event, right? Going from one solar system to another. It just takes a little bit of that over time to spread out into many different places around a galaxy or even around, the universe, let's say. Yeah, but there's some interesting evidence for it. And one of those bits of evidence is what's called the Moore's law of genetic complexity. You've all heard of Moore's law for semiconductors. It's a made up law. But the idea is that for whatever reason, every, I don't know what it is, 10 years or 5 years, whatever the number is, the complexity of the computer chips doubles, right? And the speed doubles. And so we're always, you'll see if you read in computer magazines, there's this, have we reached the end of Moore's law? And then somebody discovers quantum computers, right? And so then, et cetera. So, it's more just an observation of what happens. So somebody thought to look at the complexity of DNA and the regulatory regions of DNA that are in many ways like a computer, right? These are the areas upstream of the regions of the genes that encode the proteins, the things that we are, and the enzymes that make us, et cetera. There are these regulatory regions, which, if you're a computer scientist, you would look at and you would think of as the actual code of how a person is made. Okay, and now the complexity of that in, let's say, simple bacteria, it's extremely simple, right? They don't have the kind of regulatory phenomenon that we have.
Okay.
But if you think of bacteria as a ancient example of what our great grandparents might look like, right? And then you look and you go up the chain of evolution from bacteria to eukaryotes to multicellular things, et cetera, up the chain, and you call that evolution, right? That's all we really have to see right now. And then you basically say, well, bacteria evolved, I don't know, 2 billion years ago, whatever the number is. These are the ones so you create that timeline and then you give some measure of complexity. It turns out that the complexity of when things actually started was about 10 billion years ago.
Billion or million?
Billion. Okay, but how long has Earth been around? 4 billion years.
4 billion. Exactly.
Right? Okay, so there's a 6 billion year gap.
Uh-huh.
So basically, there's two answers to that. The first answer is it actually evolved that long ago.
Right.
6 billion years ago. Or something about evolution took a fast leap up and then became the straight line.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that up part.
So it's either if life on Earth happened and instantiated only 4 billion years ago,
Mm-hmm.
fast leap up and then became this linear curve.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perfectly possible. Or you could say it started somewhere else and just traveled here.
Right.
Okay. And so that's the first one. I find that interesting. The second one is a paper, and that actually is a paper, and then peer-reviewed. And there's another peer-reviewed paper called The Wow Signal in the Genetic Code by a couple of mathematicians from, I think, Uzbekistan. And I don't pretend to understand the math, and I'm sure there's some statisticians that would argue with it, but their concept was interesting. The actual, what we call the genetic code, the transfer RNAs that basically say, a proline goes here, a leucine goes there, that allow for the proteins to be made.
Mm-hmm.
They are so well organized in terms of the structure of who codes for what, that it looks like it was designed. Right. And then they go through some mathematical models of why it had to have been designed. And, there's some caveats that I'll mention at the end here, that the chance of it not having been designed is like 1 in several hundred trillion.
Right.
Right. And what they're saying is the wow message. So you've heard of this thing called the wow message, that when somebody first thought that they heard a radio signal from another civilization, they said, wow, they wrote wow on it, and that became the wow signal. So they said, look, the signal is actually in our DNA. The fact that that DNA was planned and organized is right there in front of us. That's the wow signal.
Huh.
Now, there's a guy who wrote a book called The Selfish Gene, and his name is Richard Dawkins, a famous genetics professor from England, who basically says, look, that's rubbish, not this wow signal itself, but, the whole notion of divine intervention or planned genetics, the creationists, it's rubbish because there are other mathematical principles that you can throw at this that say that you don't need that, and I think this guy is fantastic, right? So his is a fantastic counter argument to the wow signal, but it isn't the disproof, right? Saying that there is an alternate explanation isn't proof of the alternate explanation, right? It's like it's still in limbo, right, as to whether this wow signal is true or not. Even if it's not true, the fact that the DNA code is so organized in and of itself is beautiful. mean, as a scientist, I appreciate the beauty of that, right? It's so well organized, and I mean, but we can look at any ecosystem and say it's so well organized, somebody must have invented it. No, you don't have to invent it. Richard Dawkins shows how things can evolve.
So what about, I mean, this makes me start thinking about fractals and energy and patterns and recurring patterns in nature. And I mean, what about that? What about just patterns of energy showing up on a micro and a macro level?
Mm-hmm.
What about that?
Well, I mean, yeah. So the universe is organized with a pattern, right? If you look right down at the laws that we think are running the universe, all of these particles with features and capabilities, and how they will interact, that allow for us. Basically, it says that embedded in the structure of the universe is the capability to produce us. Now, the open question is, did somebody create the universe so that something like us could occur?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or is it just chance and we're lucky?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's this concept in the multiverse ideas of that in other universes, the laws of physics might be different.
Right.
That if you take the various, what we call constants of physics, Planck constant, et cetera, as all these, various numbers, and you change them only slightly, any one of them only slightly, suddenly you don't have a universe like ours that could even have protons, right? That it would basically, you wouldn't get anything. It would just remain a big mist. Nothing could ever coalesce into anything. So there's this notion of what's called the anthropic, I think it's called the anthropic principle, that we only think of ourselves as the only universe that is because the laws are such that we can see ourselves.
Right.
But in the other universes, no one could become. And if you were to go there, you would basically just explode. You would just dissipate into nothing.
Right.
Right. So embedded in the laws of the universe are the rules that allow for evolution. Right. It doesn't mean that the universe was created for that. It's just that retrospectively, it is that. There's a science fiction book that I always remember, a story about this thing that evolved in an ocean on another planet, and it began with, it could not remember, but could deduce its origins. Right. So we can't remember our origins, but we can deduce them.
Sure.
We can deduce the kinds of things that must have happened. And then we can even go beyond that now, as I'm saying about the structure of the universe, to say that the structure of the universe allows for atoms, it allows for molecules. Those molecules can come together, and if they can reproduce, they will. That's the essence of the selfish gene from Richard Dawkins, is that if given resources and you can reproduce, you will find a way to reproduce. Right? So you don't need to imagine a God, right, that created you.
Right.
But and he goes through a lot of very good arguments about it. But so that's the kind of way that I think of it, that it says that if we came from a panspermic event, I'm not sure that's a word, but just made it up, then that means that there are other potentially seeded planets elsewhere that also could have created civilizations. Now, and then if you go as far as saying that there are other universes,
exactly,
which have, let's say, different timelines, once you propose that another universe can happen and it might have a different timeline than ours, there's no such thing as a common timeline at that point. You're independent. You can come from any point in another universe's timeline, and if you are sufficiently advanced, you might have learned ways to jump between universes.
Fascinating. Right? What do you think is the most likely theory of the universe? The multiverse, simulation theory, holographic?
I think the holographic and simulation theory, I mean, I'm closer to the holographic idea because we are a low dimensional projection of something of a higher dimension. We know that other dimensions exist. That doesn't mean other dimensions meaning other realities. It means that the 4 dimensions that we think of are a subset of something more complex, because our understanding of how the physical particles operate in many of the theories requires additional concepts of other dimensions.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that other things live there, but maybe they do. I don't know. But so I'm more aligned with the holographic notion. The idea of a simulation, I mean, that implies, I mean, very often what that brings to mind is the notion that somebody's sitting behind a computer terminal somewhere running us, like a Sims game.
Right.
And, that's a little too simplistic, obviously. But, if you created the universe with all of these rules, like it looks like a giant computer program, which it does, fine, call it a simulation. I don't care. I mean, a simulation implies that it's not real. I mean, that we exist only in somebody else's computer. But that doesn't matter to me. As far as I'm concerned, I'm real.
Yeah, it doesn't change the way you live your life. It's still
about me. And unless they're going to reach in and change the code halfway through because they decide we're buggy or we're caught in a loop,
okay. I mean, looping is a thing. I mean, people do loop. You loop on patterns with people, patterns with how you operate. I mean, that does happen. And I do wonder if there's that possibility where I was just having this conversation the other day that if we were to, I don't know, shift dimensions, ascend, new earth, whatever the concept or theory is, would you even know?
No, I agree. I mean, I was thinking about something like this the other day. I was watching some History Channel or something, just flipping through late at night about reincarnation, the concept of reincarnations, and okay, if we reincarnate infinitely, in some ways, it almost sounds depressing. Sort of like I'm kind of like I'm done.
How many people say that, right? They're like, no, this is my last human trip, promise.
I'm done. But if that's just the way of things, but if we get erased each time, well, then it doesn't matter. It's not like there's a memory of all of the dramas that you went on before. So, I'm not quite sure about what it is, but I mean, obviously the older you get, the more you start to think about what's next. I'm actually excited one way or the other.
Right.
I mean, whether it's, death and it's the end, well, okay, who cares? It's the end. Or if it's some change, fine, I'm ready for it.
I've said that I really want to figure out what the truth and the nature of reality. That's my biggest question that I have in my life is what is the true nature of this reality that we live in? And I said, I'm going to have to die to find out. I'm just not ready. Like this can be really fun and really interesting here in the meantime.
I mean, I would hope, and this is perhaps narcissistic, that having achieved a level of self-introspection about that is an indication that you're, ready for a next level, right? That if you're oblivious to it, you're no different than, an animal, right? I'm not disparaging animals, but that if they're not conscious of it, then you're not ready for that next level. I don't know.
Well, consciousness, you said the word. I mean, such an interesting concept and theory, and so many people wondering about the nature of it. What are your thoughts on it? Because that to me, when I think about the universe and I think about patterns of things and how it might all really be unfolding, there's this unique element of consciousness, of being aware of the thoughts we're having, being aware of these things. And it's like, what is that unique like pathway of information that comes to us that makes it feel less mechanical and less like data? It feels, there's a feel to it. So what are your thoughts on consciousness at this point?
Well, if you are a brain scientist, you think that consciousness is just the pattern of electrical signals between neurons. Maybe. But if we go back to that notion of there's like a complex structure to the universe of all of these particles interacting, fields, etc. Okay, well, somehow, whatever our consciousness is, whether you're a materialist like a neurosurgeon or you're a spiritualist, doesn't matter. Your consciousness still sits somewhere in that space-time, right? It's just the neurologist would think of it as your brain organizes the space-time to create consciousness. It's still sitting in that ether, right? A spiritualist just says, well, maybe it sits outside the ether and reaches in with like puppet strings and manipulates the neurons, and that there's some interface that we don't yet understand that allows the thing which is sitting outside to influence the materials in this universe. So this would be a perfect example of where does consciousness sit? Well, maybe somewhere in those extra dimensions, or at the very least, it uses some of those extra dimensions.
Yeah.
That's one way of thinking about it. I'm not, again, I'll say this, and there's some idiot on Twitter who will pick apart my words and make it sound like I said something that I didn't, right? There's one person in particular who's just really annoying.
Well, they have a sad life. I don't know who they are, but they have a sad life. If all they
I don't understand them.
picking apart your brilliance.
I find it exciting to think about. I mean, they must be the most boring person at a party, Jason. You know who I'm talking about. I won't say his last name. But it rhymes with Velveeta. Whole Velveeta. So it's so consciousness then is something interesting in that no matter how you postulate it, materialism or spiritual, it does sit in space-time somewhere. Now, the open question is it independent of the body? Right? Does it, once created, is it now a pattern that can exist forever? Right? And there's actually, I've used this example before. One second, I'm going to step away and get the book. And I would recommend anybody who's interested in it. It's just a treatise. You can download it off of the internet. But he proposes a physics, again, none of which I can truly understand. But physicists argue with each other all the time.
It's the nature of the job of trying to prove things out, is arguing.
And so what he basically says is that, I'll again show this one picture, that picture.
Okay.
And it's a drawing of complexities of reality.
Okay.
And how these complexities of reality, as organized by biological organisms, can create a structure, our brain, that is sort of the birthplace of consciousness. But the math says, at least in his view of the world, the math says that once created, it doesn't need the structure anymore. Like a flower creates a seed, the seed doesn't require the flower anymore. The seed can go elsewhere. It's a postulate.
Sure.
It's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
And it's backed by a lot of math that the physicists will argue about forever. I see it at Stanford all the time when the physicists and the mathematicians get in a room together with the computer scientists and, just put them in a mud pit and let them have fun, right?
I like to watch that.
Let them wrestle. To me, that's an interesting idea, that there is a physics support for the notion that consciousness can exist independent of what created the consciousness in the first place.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So anyway, that's just to me, that's exciting. Now, whether that consciousness goes on to another place, and we can all read the books about the Monroe Institute, for instance, and this notion that there's people have out of body experiences and things.
Have you ever had one?
I had one that I was it was unlike anything else.
Okay.
Um,
Would you be willing to share?
yeah, sure. Yeah, I shared some pretty crazy stuff. No, I remember waking up and, well, I became conscious and I was in the middle of nowhere, like stars. I kind of could see around and it was like stars. And I go, oh my God, I'm in space. And oh my God, how am I going to get home? Because I'm out here in the middle of nowhere.
Lost.
And then there was like one star that was brighter than all of the others. And I said, oh, that must be my star. And then suddenly I just felt this rushing feeling. And I literally remember coming down through the trees, through the roof, and then into me. And I woke up. No, it could be just a dream. But it's the most unusual dream that I ever had that had a sense of reality. I mean, most dreams I forget.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like maybe like an astral projection.
Yeah, which is, yeah, I mean, I don't know what it was, but I found it fascinating. You
Yeah,
know,
and it resonated and you have a story and you remember it. And that's the
yeah,
thing, like you said about dreams, you normally forget. So the fact that that registered in your body and in your mind in a different way is unique. I think
right,
that those experiences are what make us ask more questions.
right.
So if we were to talk about kind of back into like DNA a little bit and um, understanding that, I also am thinking about if energy can't be created, energy cannot be destroyed, it can only transform. Like,
Mhm,
what is that? And then I'm thinking a lot about like quantum mechanics and quantum physics.
mhm.
And so, like, DNA, if we're looking just at us, what is DNA and what, because we have this idea that DNA is our future, right? Like, oh, my mom had cancer, so I'm going to have cancer. And it's just my map, you know? But explain what DNA really is and how it works.
Wow. Okay. So, well, first of all, it's an information storage device. Your dog wants he's got his, looks like he's got a rope or something.
Like, he's like, I understood until this part, and now I don't get it.
Um, so it's an information storage device. It's it's a story in motion. Like I said before, you can trace it back, at least 4 billion and perhaps more years, and its complexity is increasing. And at a certain level of complexity, let's say it instantiated the ability to have consciousness and to
Mhm,
perceive the universe.
mhm.
All those space-time particles actually realizing that they are space-time particles,
Okay.
right, in waveforms. But underneath that is an architecture. And the architecture is in the DNA, but it's also in the proteins that are bound to the DNA.
Mhm.
So, we think of the genetic code as this simple 3-letter code. It's much more complicated than that. And it's a dynamic computer that's constantly sensing the environment and changing accordingly. And so, it's just, it's a memory system because embedded in the DNA is the memory of how you evolved.
Mhm,
At
mhm.
least it's the solution to many um, challenges that the organism went through across evolutionary time.
Okay.
Right?
And you
It's
can
a I
see
mean,
that in DNA?
yeah, it's embedded in there, the solutions, right? So the solution to breathing oxygen, which is otherwise dangerous to many chemical reactions, is to have antioxidants, is to use the oxygen to power the body, right? So, the oxidative damage and oxygen will create output of energy. So what life did was it realized, well, rather than let the energy burn me, I'll use it for work. I'll make it useful.
Hmm.
So that's a solution. So energy metabolism is a solution to the poisoning that oxygen can do
Wow.
to certain systems, right? Photosynthesis is a solution to the damage of photons. Rather than letting them damage us, we'll use them to create matter. Not to create matter, but to basically, bring carbon dioxide and energy together and create energy and oxygen. But once it created that, then you have to find a way to deal with the damage that oxygen can produce. And so, so each step of the way, there were additional solutions that needed to be found through evolution. You also have to remember that for each individual, you have sort of a local memory solution. And in diversity is the solution for more potential problems, because you never know what the next problem is going to be. So this notion that diversity in genetics is important is key. I mean, the problem of the potato famine was, in Ireland back in the day, was in part a monoculture of potatoes that were being used. And that monoculture allowed for this one fungus to spread across, the potato blight to spread across all of Ireland and basically starve people. The solution was going and finding other potatoes back in the New World that were resistant to it and breeding those features in. We had the same problem in corn blight, right, et cetera. When you lower diversity, basically you're lowering the number of potential solutions, and all it takes is one ecologic change, the introduction of a fungus, to wipe the whole thing out. But if you have diversity, this is not a political discussion. But the same thing is true societally.
Sure.
At you don't want too much diversity because then it's chaos.
Right.
But you need a certain amount of diversity to maintain the potential for solutions. Mm-hmm. But that notion is natural, right? It's not a political argument. It's just a natural world solution to unexpected futures. Right, because you don't know what the future is going to bring, and so if you all thought one way, then you might not have the solution. Mm-hmm. And the UAP phenomenon is exactly a case in point. If we all think that there's absolutely no chance that UAPs are a non-human intelligence, then we'll forever just be looking at these things moving in the sky and just say, well, I don't know what they are, so therefore they don't exist. Right. And so when you have people like you and me and others who are presumably listening to this podcast, many of whom would say, well, I don't know what it is, but I know that it is.
Right. Exactly.
My mantra is knowing that it is the same thing as not saying that I believe, it's saying that I believe the data. Right. I don't believe in a conclusion. I know that the data is real. I can verify it to anybody's satisfaction that the data is real. How to interpret it is still an open question. And luckily I've seen, because I've been pushing this a lot, and a lot of people, I guess have heard me talk now, probably a few million. And I see, thankfully, these words being repeated and refined and used against the skeptics. Because I don't mind skeptics as long as they're not pathologically skeptical, right?
Right. Skepticism is healthy. It's asking questions.
It's asking questions. It's peer review, et cetera. But as long as it's not, the problem is many of them, it's to them it's disparaging. They'll use and overuse the term alien or little green men as a way to degrade those who are more open thinkers. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to me, that's disqualifying them as reasonable skeptics.
Well, I feel like people that aren't open-minded, really, it's there's a potential for the fundamentals of life to be rocked, and when that happens, it's just a house of cards for everything. Yeah. And they cling really hard to the things that they know because it keeps them safe. Yeah. to close the loop on the DNA thing that I'm curious about is the element of epigenetics and how this connects then maybe with those other dimensions. Because genetics, the epigenetics is the expression, which is epi around. What was that?
Yeah.
Isn't epi?
Yep. Epi.
So it's not the actual genetics, it's just the expression of the genetics that you're activating. So could that correlate then with these other dimensions and this connectedness that we have?
Yeah, I mean, another way to think about epigenetics is, at least the first level of it, is the proteins that are binding to the DNA. So they're the first translators, they're the first interpreters of what's in the DNA. The DNA is a scaffold that the proteins bind to because they recognize a code and they bind to that. And the code tells protein 1, 2, and 3 to bind here, here, and here. And that allows a machine to come together because of proximity. And then that machine is interpret. Basically, you can think of that machine as interpreting the underlying code. And so as you build out further and further levels of complexity, because this then builds neurons, the neurons go here and there, and then that builds consciousness. And then consciousness somehow, let's say, is again sitting in space-time. And I don't mean woo-woo, I mean it truly is. You and I are just patterns of space-time. And then, so yeah, at the end of the day, the DNA is architecting a structure that creates consciousness. Now, it took, for at least 4 billion years to happen, right, for it to do that. But DNA doesn't care. DNA doesn't think about time. DNA only thinks about survival, right? I mean, the rule of the selfish gene hypothesis is survive, at all costs. Now, from a consciousness standpoint, is at what point does consciousness intervene and say, is at all cost really the rule, right? Do I now intervene and say, okay, well, at all cost doesn't mean me against you,
right?
It means us, right? And somehow us is what takes us forward, because the us principle actually is a greater form of survival.
Right.
It's kind of it becomes like a tribe.
Yeah, exactly.
And then when does the concept of a tribe translate to a nation, to a people, to, multiple peoples or multiple things? So I wonder sometimes when, let's say that these things that we're seeing are real. Notice I use the word if still.
Sure.
Let's say that they are doing what they're doing and they're more advanced. Clearly, they're interested in us. It is interested in us, whatever it is. They're not intervening, not stomping on us, right? If they wanted to stomp on us, clearly they could. All they would need to go is out to the asteroid belt and throw a big rock at us, and that'd be the end of us. Right? I mean, it doesn't take much effort. Musk could probably do it if he got mad at Twitter for not letting him buy them. So that was like that'd be an ultimate Bond movie. So, maybe their purpose is like our purpose with setting up national parks or nature preserves in Africa and South America. They've set us up as a nature preserve. I mean, frankly, I don't know why we're bothering, going to Mars. Why don't we just go, 10 miles underground and build out caverns and put big lights up? There's lots of energy. There's lots of geothermal energy down there, right?
I mean, do you believe in a hollow Earth theory or
no, not hollow Earth, but if there are bases here,
yeah.
Well, they're clearly not on the surface. They're underground. We see things coming and going from the water all the time. Great place to go. Humans aren't bothering down here. They don't have the technology to live down here, but you don't have to go far enough down,
right,
to do things. You could hollow out caverns and live underground. And maybe what we're seeing is actually some dinosaurs that became sufficiently intelligent, and they basically said, well, let's just get out of the way of all of these climate changes and just go underground because we're happier underground than whatever. I don't know. I mean, I'm just making it up as I go along.
Sure. I mean, there's plenty of those theories out there about all of that stuff.
The surface of the planet, we're so frigging centric. We think that the surface of the planet is what everybody would want because we want it.
Exactly. And then we look for us out there in the universe too. But what if it's not us? What if it's not just like this? Because there are so many brilliant people like yourself that talk about how fickle it is to even exist with slight changes in oxygen and all kinds of base elements that we have. We could be gone.
One big solar flare is going to basically crush the planet because, it'll knock out all our electrical systems. I mean,
and they happen all the time. Solar flares happen all the time, right?
Yeah. And just all it takes is like one really bad one and it'll be like an EMP pulse. And it would knock out all of our electrical systems. Talk about a disaster. So, and maybe that's the reason why they basically said, well, let's just go underground, or we can tell that a perfectly good reason for doing something like that would be you look into the nearby solar systems and you realize that there's a star within a few hundred light years that's about to go nova.
Yeah.
And that the radiation front from that nova would basically wipe out your civilization. Right. So how do you harden it? You go underground. Once you're underground for a few generations, you're like, well, why do I need the surface? I'm perfectly happy down here. Let's let the surface be as it is, and we'll go look at it like a park and stroll around when we need to. I don't know. I'm just, again, making it up.
You went to Antarctica, right?
Yeah.
Did you find any bases in Antarctica?
No, I didn't find any bases there. I did read a book by, who's that guy, Hancock? Graham Hancock. I don't know why I picked it up. And on the way there, it was all about Antarctica. Oh. And the original, he basically was saying, Atlantis was in Antarctica before some big global shift, and he writes a great story. I don't know how much of it is true.
Was it Fingerprints of the Gods, or was it the next one?
No, it was one. I don't know which one it was, but it was the one kind of salient point that he continues to raise is that all cultures have a history of a flood, and that soon after the flood, these people showed up. And interestingly, and this is like everywhere from South America to, Middle East, etc. People who show up in the drawings and the carvings look the same, and they're carrying like a purse.
Right. Oh yeah, I've seen them. I've been to Egypt. I've been to Chichen Itza. I've been to a bunch of ancient sites, Peru. Yeah, there's all kinds of crazy symbols where they look like they're holding a bag.
A bag. And so it's like, that's interesting. Again, I don't think it concludes anything, but he weaves a beautiful story.
Right.
And so I was reading that on the way across and while I was in Antarctica. So I didn't see anything. I mean, the place is gorgeous.
Really?
Oh yeah, absolutely gorgeous. Yeah.
Not just flat and barren?
No. Especially the peninsula. There are rock formations and things, and we took a helicopter around these towers of rock out in the middle. And I mean, just otherworldly, truly.
And you were looking for UAPs, or you were just no?
Just it had always been a bucket list kind of thing to do. And so we went on this. It was a pretty high end thing. It had helicopters and a submarine on it. So I spent a fortune on it, but it was worth it.
So cool. That sounds fascinating. I'm very interested in Antarctica myself. You were talking about, this sort of come together all for one and the power of that. And then I can't help but think about AI and, the future and the trajectory of AI and how that may affect us. And also whether or not that is the next phase. I mean, if our consciousness can be put in a forever body of some sort, then is it really any different? I mean, we're essentially being upgraded in a way, or is there something special and unique to this biological human body that we essentially believe has, not been made?
Right. Well, can AI be conscious in the same sense as I've just been discussing it about some level of complexity that instantiates something independent? At least, probably not now, right? Or not in our more immediate future. Can it replicate what we think is consciousness? Very likely. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you already have seen the arguments about Google,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that thing that, that program, it's, I don't think it's conscious, but, it was pretty remarkable. It was a far more interesting dinner conversation than I've had with even some of my professor friends from Harvard and MIT, right? I mean, much more open and, interesting. I would love to have someone like that as a conversationalist,
Mm.
right? So now, where does the transition happen for us? Well, again, I mean, I hate to boost his already immense ego, but not that he's listening to this. Elon Musk, basically, I didn't say stole, but borrowed the concept of neural links from science fiction. This notion that you can interface and access compute abilities. We do it already. I mean, Wikipedia is like everybody's an expert if they can type in the search terms and get a Wikipedia concept. Imagine that being instantly available to your head.
It's an upgrade.
It's an upgrade. Imagine, something which is recording your every moment so that when you say, "Where are my keys?" the compute in your head said, I saw you leave it on the table downstairs. And it
Helpful.
flashes that image to you,
Sure.
right? That's coming, right? It's coming one day. And so we've now transferred our memory, much of our capability of the memory, to the computer, let's say in some near future. It could record your life. So now, I mean, at 61, I can barely remember some of my former dogs. I can remember them, but I can't remember the moment that I just had with two of my dogs in bed this morning, petting them and, loving them. But maybe I could recreate that. So I've now transferred memory, emotions, and the recreation of those memories and moments to a computer. What's left? Maybe just the decision processes, but then maybe we start to give the decision processes over to the computer. What should I do today? Well, here's the most efficient way to do all the stuff that you're doing. So we become smaller and smaller and smaller, and what we've handed over to an AI is larger. And so at what point do we decide as humans that we don't need that anymore? Because most of what we are is now in the computer. I would say that that doesn't have a soul, at least if a soul is true. But maybe that's what we're seeing in these UAPs, because it's a natural extension of where we're going. Unless we create laws that stop it from happening, or there's some sort of a pogrom, or a crusade against them, it's coming. And so we will transfer ourselves over. And then, unfortunately, people like Musk would live forever.
Fortunately, people
Sorry,
like you would, but fortunately, people like you would.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, unless he turn us all into slave robots. But
Well, if you're in
anyway,
a computer, the danger is Control Alt Delete.
Control Alt Delete.
That's also a danger.
I mean, believe me, if Elon gets something that, or somebody else, there's other people as well, just using him as an example, get something that allows for memory aids, I'll be all for it. If it doesn't, if it doesn't like destroy my brain in the process of upgrading, and that I can't upgrade further at another point, I'll do it.
What about intelligence upgrades?
Oh, sure.
And increasing the data that you have on board.
Right.
So you're a fan of some of the potential of Neuralink.
Yeah. But I mean, you've heard me probably talk about where does creativity and insight come from, and where are we accessing these downloads that people get.
Have you ever had that, by the way, with
my God,
your work? Does it feel like I'm glad you said that, because it seems like a lot of really brilliant people end up actually backing up into an idea that they had originally and then figuring out essentially the math to it. And so what are some of those epiphanies?
There are many books written about this, and going back decades, about how people have realized that they just get these ideas out of nowhere. I think that if we transfer ourselves to AI, we'd lose that.
Yeah.
I'm implying that there's some woo-woo associated with where we get these ideas from. Right? I mean, I won't parse words. You could imagine it as some sort of subconscious process that truly is just all mathematics, or there's something else going on, because some of the ideas that I've had came from absolutely nowhere. There's no way I would have known what these things were before I thought the idea. So it's like, okay, well, did somebody give it to me? Or, I don't like to think that there's a guardian angel or somebody out there who really cares about me personally. Or is there something about the way you structure the question that, and there's a saying, I can't remember if it's a Zen or a Buddhist concept, that the perfect question is the flip side of the perfect answer. That if you structure the question in just the right way, the answer is obvious. Right? That the question almost presupposes the answer. And so maybe if the physics of the universe is, some people say it's an information physics. If the physics of the universe, and it can traverse time, let's say, and let's say that we don't understand enough about the universe to say that it can't, then if your brain puts together a conscious structure that is the question, it might be asking and, it might be querying the universe for the answer. So it's your executive function of who we think we truly are that organizes the question in a way in our brain that creates the query. And it just takes time and the right moment for all of that to have come together to the answer comes, and boom, it gets downloaded because it was already there.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not that anybody's giving it to you. It's you're giving it to you by creating. And again, it's all postulates.
Where does it come from? What do you think, speaking of questions, what do you think is the most important question that humans can ask?
Are we alone? That to me is the most important question. If we're not alone, then somebody else might have answers to other, let's say, less or more immediate existential questions, right? That, what can we do about this? What can we do about that? Or, are there other dimensions? Are there, what is, you could list 1,000 questions, and, if they would be willing to give us the answers, right? And I personally think that, frankly, we're not, I've said this before, I think we're just a bunch of angry apes. I don't think we're ready for some of the answers yet. And, it's like you don't tell your children certain things until they're mature enough. And we've pretty much proven that we're still not mature enough yet. It's interesting. Evolution, as I said before, doesn't care about time. DNA doesn't care about time. We're sort of the first level of civilization that was achieved out of competition, right? The tribe that was more competitive than the other, and frankly more aggressive, and that frankly had, narcissistic, psychopathic leaders that were willing to unite a continent, at the expense of blood, were the ones that succeeded. But as we're seeing played out in today's politics, without getting political, that's not necessarily a survival trait for a species.
Right. It's short-term win, long-term loss.
Long-term loss. So is the long-term play for evolution the creation of a certain level of complexity that either realizes it needs to get rid of that aggression, or there will be a collapse, rise until the genetics is selected for. That is an interesting study that was done, and I don't remember who did it and whether it was validated or not, but it was shown that in women after wars, that it was more likely for the women's boy children to be homosexual.
Interesting.
Okay, why? Okay, what? And the postulate was that they would be less aggressive, and so there's kind of an encoding in the woman to fear of a problem, times of stress, that, okay, we need to lower the aggression in the males because they're getting out of control. Okay, now, does this happen? There's certainly other cases showing that the grandmother who is starved has a baby, and if it's a woman, is epigenetically programmed to have a child who is more likely to gain weight. So there's this, it's an epigenetic programming event. You can basically, there was a big thing between Darwinians and Lamarckians back in the day. Lamarck was his idea was that a giraffe's neck gets longer because it was reaching for it. And somehow that gets encoded into the DNA.
Sure.
And so that was discounted for almost 100 or so years, and yet now we find these little subtle hints that, in fact, Lamarck wasn't entirely wrong. So and aggression can be moderated, apparently. And I don't know that being gay is the right answer, but maybe it doesn't need to be gay, just less aggressive children.
Sure.
Right. Or less likely to want to fight over the females. Sorry to bring all that in, but it's, that's our history. And so, so there's sort of a self-regulating capacity in human society that is at least epigenetically flexible. And that we, if we think of us having an absolutely determined outcome, it's not quite right, because our genes,
right,
epigenetically, are listening to the context. And so there's a little bit of flexibility built in there. And that just makes sense from to build that in from an evolutionary standpoint is to, remember, you're trying to build in solutions. And if the solution is to be a little bit more flexible, to turn the meter up or down a little bit, you don't want it hard-coded, because hard-coding of genes takes a long time to evolve in. But if you can hard-code in a rheostat, then that listens to the environment, and it mostly is going to come in through the eggs and less likely to come in through sperm because the eggs are more complex. You can basically say that the woman as a sensor is the one that provides the egg and the ability for the next generations, at least most immediate generations, to be modulated a little bit. I just find that fascinating. Anyway.
Wow. If there was if we were to be able to use extraterrestrial intelligence and there was some communication had, and we were able to learn something, as you said, they might have some solutions to our problems. What is the problem that you think needs the solution right now?
I think aggression leads to greed. Aggression leads to overuse of resources, polluting the planet. I don't think you want to get rid of aggression entirely, because somewhere in aggression is also motivation, right? And I'm aggressive in my lab work. I want I want my people to win an argument around some science. So I think there's a little bit that's good. So I think that somehow, how do we modulate that? To me, that's almost the most important, because it if you take any one of our problems, you can trace them back. One of the roots, at the very least, is over-aggression. And another would be, energy. Obviously, is there a better way to create energy than burning up something that lived 200 million years ago?
Well, it seemed like Nikola Tesla had some answers, right?
Yeah. There's a great guy, if anybody ever wants to look it up, there's a guy at the University of Colorado, Boulder, Garrett Modell, Moddel, and he's been looking into these devices, and he's a serious physicist. He's not one of these free energy, nuts, spinning magnets and stuff. Obviously, I've looked into all of this, so I'm a nut too. He has what he claims is an ability to, it looks like, suck the energy of space-time out through an asymmetric Casimir cavity. You got to go look it up. It's the 0-point energy field.
Okay.
And he seems to be creating power out of nothing. And he's created, he says, thousands of devices, because they're all miniature.
Yeah, maybe I've heard about this guy.
And I just heard this the other day. He's given it to NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is, a government organization that validates all kinds of things. They're the ones who basically says, this is how much water weighs. These are kind of the fundamental principles. And he's given these devices, and it's claimed that they've reproduced the observation, that he's getting these minute amounts of power basically out of space-time. Now, what everybody's trying to do is prove or disprove whether that's an artifact or not.
What's this guy's name again?
Garrett, Garret, Modell, Moddel. And he got a patent on this, which is unusual because a lot of these so-called free energy devices, they don't allow for patents because people say they're junk. I don't know why they do that, but I mean, there is a blue jay that sees himself in the windows of the house, and he keeps tapping on the windows.
Oh, hello. I don't know what visitor that is. This is believing that there is somehow a consciousness that can come through a bird and say hello to you.
Say hello, exactly. Yeah. They I looked it up. Apparently it's males do it, and there must be a female and fledglings nearby.
I do have a last question. It's kind of a two-part. Is there information, technology, and being withheld from the general public about extraterrestrial and all things extraterrestrial? And if they were, why would they do that?
Do I absolutely know for sure because I've seen it? No, I do not know that. Do I think that it's the case? Absolutely, yes. And I have good reason to say that, that I can't talk about, but I have good reason to say it. So my interest is obviously, and I've said this many times, any involvement that I want to have in this will eventually or should eventually lead to public disclosure. Yeah. Right. Now, whether I'm allowed to do that, should I ever get involved or be allowed to be involved? Nobody's asked me, so I'm not, that would be my goal, because I think there's a virtuous cycle that can occur by letting the public in, because if there is anything to have been learned, they haven't learned much in the last 60 years. And, or at least if they're letting it out, they're letting it out so slowly as to be imperceptible to the public. But what I also know is that anything that is kept in silos, which internal special access programs are inevitably kept as silos, there's no ability to move forward quickly. I just know this in my lab. If person X doesn't talk to person Y, they're both just, they each have a piece that the other needs to create the solution. And so I think the question is, how do you manage let's call it a public government / private collaboration that keeps the needs of everybody happy, where the government is basically holding right now all the cards, and probably a few aerospace companies, but not the aerospace companies at large, basically small programs within them. And if you started to understand how the government funds these programs, you understand how quickly things can go south and become disconnected from the original funding.
Because
right?
they keep them separate?
They keep them separate, yeah. So, I mean, to me, and whether, there's somebody sitting in an office listening to us laughing, saying, yeah, well, they're never going to know. Forget them. They can talk all they want. Fine.
We need to tap into the quantum and get the information.
We need to, tap into something beyond. But I think that's what, so the short answer is, I think yes.
Yeah.
But even I'm not satisfied that the proof is there, because I still have the standards of science that I want to apply to that, which means there needs to be reproducibility. I don't want somebody just to stand on a lectern and tell me that it is. I want to see it, but I also don't want to give the government permission to tell me to be interested in something or to believe something or not. I don't need their permission. I don't need them to announce it. A lot of people do, but I don't need them to announce it. I mean, as you know, I've seen stuff. I mean, I saw a craft when I was a kid. End of story. It was 30 feet away.
How old were you?
12-ish. I can't remember when I was a paper boy. I was a paper boy for like 4 or 5 years. So I know I saw something, and I know it wasn't human, right? So, okay. But that's anecdote to the rest of the world.
Why would they hide this stuff? Why? What would be the highest potential reason why information would be withheld from all of us?
Well, I mean, people have talked about, mass hysteria, et cetera. Maybe there's something about them that's really scary. That to know that we are somebody else's property, or, heaven help, that maybe we're farmed for something. That would be awful. That would be icky. It isn't as if we don't farm things, but just to know that you're not the top of the food chain might not be a pleasant thing. But, again, it's about what information do you give to a species like us that they wouldn't kill themselves with, right? If you give people access to free energy, is even a small amount of free energy only a step away to too much energy, that you basically blow up the planet, literally. The amount of energy sitting in 1 cubic centimeter of space-time is enough to wreak havoc on the whole planet. But it's all tightly bound in space.
Is that called dark energy?
No, it's a 0-point field, the 0-point energy field. Dark energy might be part of that. I don't know. Good question, actually. But anyway, just what we understand about the 0-point field, where particles appear and disappear, sort of like, I think of it, and a physicist might yell at me for saying this, I think of it as the pressure in the balloon that keeps the universe expanding.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Sure. Because it's constantly expanding.
It's constantly there, and it's that energy. But and this is what that guy Garrett Medell, and everybody's been claiming that maybe it could happen. But there are these notions of the laws of thermodynamics that say it can't. Well, it's interesting that luckily even physicists call them laws.
Sure.
Well, people can change laws.
Yeah, it's true.
Information
comes in.
Maybe it's just a law because maybe it's a law because it works within our framework.
Maybe our framework changes. So many thought-provoking things. Thank you for sharing such great introspection and really just philosophizing and, contemplating all of the potentialities out there. And I have no doubt that between you and your lab and all of those that are working on these questions, that we'll continue to find them in our lifetime. Maybe not all of them.
Right.
Maybe we have to die for that, but definitely.
There's a really good thing that I'm seeing, and maybe this is a good message to end on, is that the circle of individuals who's willing to talk about this stuff openly has dramatically expanded. The scientific colleagues that I have, I mean, I was just at 2 meetings in the last couple of weeks, who walk up to me and out of the blue say, Garry, I've heard about all this stuff going on, and I know that you're interested in it. It's amazing. Can you tell me more? Those same colleagues 3 years ago, their eyes would have glazed over, or they would have dismissed it. So, I think there has been a sea change. I find that hopeful.
Absolutely. And then thanks for being brave enough to go ahead and step outside the box and be willing to talk about it with me and other people and just within your work. It's really cool. And we're gonna get answers because of people like you.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Garry. Thanks, everybody, for listening to the Pretty Intense podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you heard today and you want to hear more, please click on the subscribe button.